After nearly 20 years of public silence on the subject, Guy Penrod and David Phelps have each done something that nobody in the gospel community quite expected. In separate conversations that have come to light over the past year, no coordination between the two men, no joint interview, no planned moment. Both of them addressed the chapter they shared inside the Gaither Vocal Band. They addressed what those years cost them. They addressed what they saw in each other. And they addressed the kind of truth about that time that neither of them had been willing to say plainly before now. What Guy said stopped people who have followed his ministry for 3 decades. What David said, when placed beside Guy's account, is what the gospel community is still sitting with. By the time this story reaches its fullest point, around the 10-minute mark, you will understand why what both men said has landed the way it has, and you will hear the homecoming recordings differently for the rest of your life. Stay with us. Guy Penrod joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1994. He came from Cisco, Texas, a small town in the West Texas Hill Country, and he brought with him a baritone voice that Bill Gaither later described as exactly what the group needed at exactly the right moment. For the next 14 years, Guy was the constant in a group that saw many changes. Tenors came and went, arrangements shifted. The homecoming world grew from a regional gathering into a national institution. Through all of it, Guy was there, grounding every recording, anchoring every stage, giving audiences a reason to trust what they were about to hear. His most celebrated recording is probably Somebody Loves You, but fans who have watched the homecoming videos closely know that no single song captures what Guy brought to that stage. It was something more settled than a performance, a presence. A man who seemed to have already resolved the questions that most people spend a lifetime working through, and who carried that resolution into every room without ever drawing attention to it. He built a large family alongside that career. He and his wife Angie have 10 children, and anyone who has followed Guy's public life knows this is not incidental detail. Family is the frame within which every decision he has made in ministry was made. It explains when he joined the GVB, how long he stayed, and ultimately why he left. David Phelps joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1997. He came from Tomball, Texas, not far geographically from Guy's roots, with classical training that had no real precedent in the homecoming world. He had studied voice at a level that pointed toward opera houses and concert halls. What he found, over the course of his life and his faith, was that the music pulling at him most deeply was the music of the church. That redirection, from the concert hall to the gospel stage, is a story he has told publicly across many years, and he has always told it with honesty about what it cost him and what it gave him. The moment most associated with his name is the climax of End of the Beginning. If you have seen it, you do not need it described. If you have not, no description does it justice. What can be said is that audiences who witnessed it live describe a particular kind of stillness in the room, the sense that what was happening in front of them required something other than the ordinary response of applause. From 1997 to 2006, Guy and David shared the Gaither Vocal Band stage. They harmonized on recordings that found their way into millions of American homes. They worshiped together in arenas and churches and auditoriums across the country. By every visible measure, they were part of something extraordinary. What was invisible, what neither man addressed publicly for nearly 2 decades, is what this video is about. Here is something that fans of the homecoming world have noticed for years without always being able to name it. Since both men left the Gaither Vocal Band, David in 2006, Guy in 2008, they have given hundreds of interviews between them. Podcast conversations, church settings, homecoming retrospectives, the kind of reflective interviews that come naturally to men in their 60s looking back at careers spanning decades. Both men are thoughtful. Both are willing to speak honestly about faith and calling. And in all of that material, across nearly 20 years, they have almost never spoken about each other, not with hostility. Nothing that signals a wound or a falling out, simply an absence, a gap where, given everything they shared, you would expect more. Fans who follow this world closely have noticed it for years. It surfaces in comment sections and fan communities, that quiet observation, why don't these two speak about each other the way the other GVB members do? And the question it raises, Is there something between them that has never been made public, has never had a clean answer, until now? To understand what finally broke that silence, you have to go back to a moment that predates David Phelps's arrival in the GVB by 3 years. Because the chapter that came immediately before their time together is the key to understanding everything about why their dynamic was what it was. In 1994, Michael English left the Gaither Vocal Band. He had been one of the group's most celebrated members, a Grammy winner, a Dove Award winner, a man whose talent was as visible and as celebrated as the faith he sang about. And then, in circumstances that became public in a painful way, he was gone. For the Gaither community, for the audiences who had invested deeply in what those recordings represented, it was a genuine wound, the kind that takes real time to close. Guy Penrod stepped into that space the same year. He was not replacing Michael English. No one could do that. But he was taking a place in a group that had just been through something serious, in front of an audience that was still finding its footing. What Bill Gaither needed in that moment was not another showstopper. He needed someone stable, someone whose faith functioned as a foundation rather than a performance, someone the audience could trust again, at a moment when trust had been tested. Guy Penrod was precisely that person. And the role that circumstance handed him, the anchor, the spine, the one who holds the center, shaped everything about how he operated in that group for the next 14 years. When David Phelps arrived in 1997, the group had spent 3 years rebuilding its identity around that stability, around what Guy represented and what his presence provided. And David walked in with a gift so individual, so unmistakably singular, that it immediately created a new negotiation, not through any fault of his own, but simply because of what the gift was and what it required of everyone around it. Bill Gaither has spoken about this tension in various public settings across the years. He has said that assembling the GVB lineup of the late 1990s and early 2000s was one of the most gifted things he ever did, and one of the most genuinely complex things to manage. He has spoken about the difference between individual talent and group identity, about how those two things pull in opposite directions, about the sustained human work required to hold both in the same room across years of touring and recording. What he describes, without always making it explicit, is a creative pressure that was real and constant and entirely invisible to the audiences watching from the outside. Stay with us, because what that pressure produced in both Guy and David, and what each man has now addressed publicly for the first time, is not what the gospel community expected to hear. And this is where the story takes a turn that changes how you hear those homecoming recordings. In conversations that have surfaced over the past year, Guy Penrod addressed something about his GVB years that he had never said plainly before. He spoke about a season. He did not pin it to specific dates, but the shape of what he described points to the years when the group was at its most publicly celebrated, when he wrestled with something he called spiritual confusion. He described standing on that stage night after night alongside a voice that could stop a room completely, and he addressed what that did to him. Not jealousy. He was careful about that word, deliberate not to use it, something harder to name, a quiet questioning of whether the contribution he was making was enough. Whether faithfulness to the anchor role, the man who grounds the group, who makes everyone around him sound better, who holds the center when everything else is in motion, was the same thing as faithfulness to the calling God had placed on his life. For Guy Penrod to address this publicly is not a small thing. This is a man whose composure is one of the defining features of his ministry. A man who has always projected settled assurance, the idea that beneath that composure, during those homecoming years, something was genuinely in question. That is not what his fans expected to hear. He said it resolved. He was clear about that. And how it resolved is something his longtime fans will recognize immediately as consistent with who Guy Penrod is. He returned to the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians, the passage about the body and its members, about the eye not being able to say to the hand that it has no need of it. He has said that passage stopped being familiar theology and became something personal, a direct confrontation with the way he had been measuring his own contribution against the contribution of the man standing beside him. When he let go of that measuring, something released that had been held tight for a long time. He described a specific night, a homecoming taping, the exact event lost to him now, when David hit one of those notes, the kind that made the room go completely still, and Guy's response, instead of the complicated feeling he had been carrying, was simply gratitude for the friend beside him, for the stage they shared, for the God who had put both of them in that room, for that audience at that time. That was when the difficult season ended for Guy. Now, David Phelps, in his own public reflections over this same period, addressed something that landed with equal force. He spoke about the anxiety he carried during his GVB years, not about his voice. His confidence in what his voice could do was never in question. About fit, about belonging, about whether what he brought was the right thing for the place he was in. He described his time in the group as both extraordinary and privately costly, the cost being a persistent uncertainty about whether he was where he was supposed to be, in the frame that actually fit his calling. He spoke about the men around him in the GVB who appeared to carry no such uncertainty. Men who seemed to have already arrived at a peace he was still working toward, a settled quality he could observe clearly, reach toward, and not quite close the distance to. He addressed the fact that being in proximity to that kind of settled faith, while his own interior life remained full of questions, was something he found genuinely hard. He has said his departure from the group in 2006 was, among other things, a decision to find out whether that peace was available to him outside the pressure of the group context, whether what he admired in the men beside him was something he could arrive at on his own terms. He has said, in recent years, that he is still finding out. Now place those two accounts beside each other. Guy, the most visibly settled man in the room, privately questioning whether his contribution was enough, in the years when the man beside him drew every individual moment of awe from the audience. David, the most individually spectacular voice in the room, privately uncertain about his fit and his belonging, in the years when the man beside him modeled a peace that David could see but could not reach. Each man was affected by the other in ways that ran directly opposite to what anyone watching from outside would have assumed. The settled one was not as settled as he appeared. The one who appeared to strain was straining toward something real, and he knew it, and the man beside him was part of why he knew it, Hermers. That is what both men have now addressed. That is what the gospel community has been sitting with. And that is why fans who have loved both of these men for 30 years respond to it the way they do, with the recognition of something they felt in that stage with both men, and has never once declined the opportunity to say what others leave unspoken, described this dynamic from the outside, years before either man addressed it directly. He called Guy the spine of the GVB, not the showstopper, not the headline, the thing that holds everything upright when the road is long, and the room needs someone to remember why they are there. And he described what David's voice did to a room, in terms that Mark Lowry, a man who has built his entire public life on never being at a loss for words, admits left him with nothing to say. Both descriptions map exactly onto what Guy and David have now each addressed about themselves and about each other. Mark saw the spine and the phenomenon from the outside. They lived it from the inside, and it took both of them the better part of 20 years to find the words. For those who have followed Guy and David since the early homecoming days, since the VHS tapes in church libraries, since the Sunday afternoon videos in living rooms across America, what both men have now addressed is probably landing somewhere specific. Because here is what devoted fans of those recordings have always known at some level, even without quite having the language for it. The homecoming stage was never primarily about entertainment. It was a place where faith was being worked out in real time, by real people, in front of audiences who were doing the same thing in their own homes and churches and lives. What Guy and David have addressed, the settled and the seeking, the anchor and the ascending, the complicated interior experience of two men sharing the same stage in very different ways, is not foreign to this community. Every person who has sat in a church beside someone whose faith seemed more settled than their own knows exactly what David was describing. Every person who has quietly wondered whether their faithful, unglamorous contribution was seen and valued knows exactly what Guy was describing. That is why it lands the way it does. Not because it is surprising that these men had interior lives the cameras did not capture, but because hearing them address it, with the honesty that comes from men who have had enough years to speak plainly, gives language to something the audience has been carrying in their own lives for a long time. If you have been a fan since the early recordings, since the tapings in Alexandria, Indiana, since the videos that felt less like concerts and more like something sacred happening in public, you know exactly what we mean when we say that the most important things on those stages were never the notes. They were the men singing them. There is one more part of this story that most people have not connected yet. The question underneath everything both men addressed is this: what happens to the men who pour themselves into a chapter like the Gaither Vocal Band, who are shaped by it in the ways Guy and David were shaped, and who then have to figure out what it made them? Both of their solo careers are, in some sense, an answer to that question. Guy's work after leaving the GVB in 2008, beginning with Breathe Deep and continuing through the recordings that followed, returned him to the traditional gospel and country gospel sound that formed him before Bill Gaither ever called. The homecoming years sharpened something in him. The solo years let him use it in the frame that fit him most naturally. He has spoken about that transition as one of the better decisions of his ministry life, and the audience that followed him through it has stayed devoted. David's path after leaving the group has been more openly searching. He has moved between classical repertoire and gospel, followed a calling that continues to resist clean category, and built a solo ministry that reflects the same reaching quality his voice has always carried, only now without the group context asking him to hold it in check. His daughter Callie has entered gospel music in her own right, and watching him support her public ministry has given fans a version of David Phelps the GVB years rarely showed. Wes Hampton joined the GVB in 2005, as that particular era was approaching its close. He has spoken about walking into a group with a gravity he could feel before he fully understood it, about inheriting something from the men who had been there, not just in the musical arrangements or the recordings, but in the character of the group itself. He has said it took years to fully appreciate what had been handed to him. That inheritance, what Guy and David left behind in that group and in those recordings, is not reducible to harmonies or vocal arrangements. It is the mark of two men who worked out serious questions of faith in close proximity to each other, over nearly a decade, without making those questions anyone else's burden. What they built was shaped by what it cost them, and what it cost them is what both of them have now, finally, been willing to address. What comes next for Guy Penrod and David Phelps is something the gospel community will follow with the kind of genuine affection that only 30 years of shared history produces. Guy continues to record and minister, rooted in the traditional gospel sound that Cisco, Texas, and 14 Gaither years formed in him. His voice has only deepened with time. David continues to move between the classical and gospel worlds, following a calling that has never resolved into a single category, and at this stage in his life likely never will. Both men are still doing the thing they have always done, following where faith leads, regardless of whether the frame is comfortable or convenient. One thread remains open. One question neither man has answered. Both have now addressed what those years meant, in their own ways and in their own settings. But what neither has done is sit in the same room and say to each other what they have now said to the rest of the world. Whether that conversation ever happens publicly, no one can know. Whether it has already happened privately is something only the two of them know. What the gospel community can say, what those who have followed both of these ministries for 30 years know without being told, is that the chapter these two men shared was not ordinary. What they have now addressed about it is not ordinary, and the faithfulness with which both of them carried it, through all the years of near silence, may be the most characteristic thing either man has ever done. Whatever comes next, their story is not finished. If what you found here stayed with you, there is more. We have been spending time with the stories behind the Gaither Vocal Band years, the relationships and quiet decisions and significant moments that shaped what millions of fans came to love, and what keeps coming through, every time, is the same truth. The music was always the smallest part of it.